All right, everybody, welcome to the 13th episode of Shred Radio. Big thanks to folks who have been tuning in. Welcome to new folks. We're super glad you're here in this universe with us. So excited to be here with you. Please take a second if y'all want to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Give us a like on YouTube. And if you'd like to support our organizing efforts, you can become a patron on Patreon. We have some great gifts for folks who donate at all levels. We have some merch. We got some handmade copper jewelry by Adornomorphosis. We have some very sick tapes, CDs, and zines from our musical projects, and a lot more. So please support us on there if you can. So today, I'm extremely excited to talk with Dr. Rami Gabriel, whose work and teaching has been an incalculable influence on us here at Shred Magazine. Rami Gabriel is the Associate Professor of Psychology in the Department of Humanities, History, and Social Sciences at Columbia College, Chicago. Rami is a founding fellow at the Columbia College Chicago Liberal Arts and Sciences Research Group in Mind, Science, and Culture. And he has 2 books out right now, Why I Buy, Self-Taste and Consumer Society in America, as well as The Emotional Mind, Affective Roots of Culture and Cognition, which was co-authored with Stephen T. Asma. So Rami has a 3rd manuscript in the works called A Suspicious Science, The Uses of Psychology. And that's what we're going to be talking about on today's episode. So aside from all this really dope and exciting research work, Rami is a composer and professional musician. He regularly plays the oud and the guitar, both locally and nationally. His musical influences center on Middle Eastern classical and folk music, American jazz, blues, and soul, as well as music concrete. He's produced several albums that folks should definitely check out. And you can check those out on Bandcamp at audiopostcards.bandcamp.com. So we'll link to everything in the description below. So Dr. Gabriel and I first met at Columbia College, where I took a couple classes taught by folks in the research group in Mind, Science, and Culture. I took a class on Sigmund Freud and 20th century art from you, and a class called Self-Identity and the Mind-Brain Question with the late Tom Greif. Now, our creative director, Ruby, also took this class with Tom. And I gotta say again, the influence of these classes was incalculable. Ruby and I would not have embarked on the political organizing path that we've been on for the past decade, and we would have not been doing this project today had it not been for those classes. So it was back in 2010 or so, but you and I reconnected a couple of years ago, and we've been in periodic contact since, playing music together and talking about ideas. Over the past several years, in my efforts to make sense of, the reification fallacy, this is something I've been obsessed with, both economically and interpersonally. When we reconnected, your advice to check out the work of Terence Deacon and your book, The Emotional Mind, which was just coming out at the time, led us directly toward the formation of Shred Magazine. So I just got to say again, this is a real pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you, Eli. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad to hear your reflections upon how your intellectual coming into being and all these things. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So one thing that's definitely a pillar of what we're doing here is we want to always remind ourselves that we're animals that exist in a dual world. One, a sensory, real-time material experience, and a second virtual world of symbols and meaning. We use symbols, words, and narratives to describe processes in the world that are not static. Ideologies, movements, political labels, even historical figures, and our favorite writers. These are all processes. So when we set out to communicate about them, we want to remind folks of what it is that we're actually doing, that we're using words and symbols and what the nature of those words and symbols are. So we want to frame everything that we do here with that up front. Rami, is there anything you'd like to add to that to frame our conversation today?
No, there's nothing I'd like to add.
Cool. All right. So today we're going to talk about an article that you have out in the publication Aeon called The Mythology of Psychology, which is the first chapter of your forthcoming book, Suspicious Science, The Uses of Psychology. So I want to split this interview up into three parts. First, I'll have you give a brief summary of what it is you're doing with the article. Then second, since we're very focused on words and symbols here at Shred, and being clear on what they're indicating to, I want us to unpack some of the more important words and concepts you use in the article so we can be super clear on what we're talking about. And finally, I want to get into the heart of the epistemology of your arguments. That is, your theory on how we can know the world. And I want to unpack why this is important and talk about some of the political implications of all this. Okay, so to start out, can you give us a summary, just a little overview of what this article is about?
Sure. This article, again, is based on the first chapter of the book. And what I'm doing is introducing some of the main concepts. One of them is how to rethink psychology, insofar as psychology is our society's method or set of methods to study the mind. And an important thing to notice here is when I say psychology, it doesn't just mean the empirical psychology of laboratory studies. This also, in my opinion, psychology includes things like popular psychology, things like the use of therapy, the use of drugs, formal and informal, how psychology plays into the arts and the humanities. So there's this multiplicity of formats that make up psychology. So I start a little bit with that, and this sort of the stakes of this are that in our era, which I describe as this post-enlightenment type of secular era, we're talking about Western intellectual society, science has a epistemological status that other modes of looking at reality do not have. And so what I describe further in the book is how out of that atmosphere, which you use the word reify, maybe sort of a reification of scientific methods as a pathway to understanding reality, psychology slipped in to sort of place itself as a natural science, sort of in between human science, natural science, social science. That's sort of the interesting thing I'm playing with, how it took elements of all of those, how it took elements of religion and metaphysics and created this amalgamation which we call contemporary psychology. So that's sort of my first part of my project. And then in this article, I'm talking about what other formats do humans have to find meaning and significance in the world, and what have we done? What did human beings do before this Enlightenment period, and even during this sort of post-Enlightenment period? And the concept that I emphasize is this concept of mythology. There are several people who've written about this, and I talk a bit about Mircea Eliade, who was a Romanian thinker who was at the University of Chicago and wrote several books about mythology and mythology in contemporary life. And I'm taking this concept of mythology and trying to wed it to the notion of what psychology does for us. How does it give us meaning and significance? And what are the terms in which it gives us meaning and significance? And so the important thing is to break this down. That's what the book is doing, is breaking down each of the elements through which the study of the mind does this. And so the first chapter is just putting those two terms together. And there's a couple things you have to do. One is you have to say, well, mythology does not just mean a wives' tale or urban legend. That's not what mythology means. Mythology is a set of practices, a set of narrative stories about origins, about why things are the way they are. And mythology also is a byproduct of lived reality, because we have symbols, we have this whole set of structures that we've created, a sort of what I call an epistemic niche that humans live in. And we've created this niche. We've created these buildings that we live in, all these other things. But we've also created thought, sort of institutionalized thought. And I want to argue that psychology is a type of institutionalized thought, or an epistemic niche that we've created to understand ourselves and to give ourselves meaning within um, the current secular worldview that dominates.
Right. So you're really talking about something. This isn't just this experimental psychology that's happening in the ivory tower away from society. This is something that's extremely intimate to our lives that we're interfacing with all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say, okay, what is going on in the laboratories, and what are the frames that they're using? Why are they using it? So in one chapter, I talk about um, the historical precedent of these forms of study. There's all these frames being used when we're studying, but at the same time, um, this is also playing out in outside the academy. And I have a whole chapter on popular psychology. So more people read popular psychology, like maybe 10 to 1 of what people read, academic psychology. And therapy is also another sort of 10 to 1 to academic psychology. So really, and the book's called The Uses of Psychology. Psychology is being used more for these applied situations than for theoretical considerations. But I feel like we need some clarity on what the theoretical um, lay of the land is, and how it conditions these practical applied uses of psychology.
Right. And you would say, right, exactly. There's that interconnectivity between the theory, what's going on in the labs and whatnot, and how that's trickling through society. And I think we're going to get into some of that, at the end of the interview here. Um, Great. Let's move on into talking about unpacking some of these words. So there's a lot of important concepts that you use here that you just use in the intro, and want to unpack what the meaning are of these for folks listening. So in the article, you talk about psychology as enmeshed with our mythical understanding of deeper questions of significance, like you were just talking about. And you do a great job of unpacking your definition of mythology. But for our listeners and viewers, can you describe, and again, you already started doing this just now, but can you go into a little more detail um, uh, uh, about what you're really talking about to drive that point home when we talk about mythology in this context?
Sure. A couple of things I get into in the article to describe this. One is the notion of heroes. So in mythology, we know about mythological heroes. The famous Greek ones, of course, are Hercules is the most famous one. But we have a whole mythological story of gods. Um, Now, one comparison I make is that we still use role models and heroes. Obviously, there's several I could point to now, uh, celebrity role models, that kind of thing, historical landmarks. Which people from history do we take out? How do we refashion them? Um, how do we mythologize figures from the past to fit the aspirations of the current moment? So this is still happening. It's happening very much in this last year, as there's been a sort of recalibration of what the goals of society are and what the oppositional formats are. So I would say heroes, and that notion of mythology is one thing to point out. Another one I point out in the article is within mythologies and traditional societies, there were also origin stories and types of pilgrimages. Pilgrimage is sort of how a devout person confirms their allegiance to the belief system. And in the secular format, the question is, well, what replaces those sorts of pilgrimages? And I suggest there are other things going on. For example, these types of Dionysian experiences of music, rock concerts, dancing. But I also point out things like people have sort of quests to understand themselves, and they find methods to look deeper. There's also this idea of where are you from, you know, these sort of searches for origin stories of their own identity. And obviously we're in an individualist society, so there's sort of transformation of these mythological systems into this context. So that's a couple of them for you: the heroes thing and the religious journey, spiritual journey sort of um, element of mythology.
Got you. Um, and in this article, you do a great job also of unpacking the concept of belief, and this is intertwined with mythology and our need for it. Um, um, and talk about why that this concept is important to humans. So I wonder if you could give us a summary again of what that definition is here for you. And maybe also go into concepts from your earlier book, The Emotional Mind, a bit more. So how does belief relate to our emotions, and how they evolved over time? How do they relate to the human symbolic capacity? And how can we conceptualize this for ourselves, like how we got here, that we are these, creatures that need belief. We need meaning. We are these meaning-based narrative creatures. How did we get here?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very complicated question, but I'll try to answer some of it. So you're referring to the Emotional Mind book, which came out in 2019, and the 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 purpose of our book was to, as the subtitle suggests, portray the affective, so the emotional roots of culture and cognition. And the way we do it is we adopt some terminology from a late neuroscientist named Jaak Panksepp, who split up his analysis of the human condition, of the animal condition, into these sort of three layers. There's these basic needs, these basic things taken care of by the body. There's the second layer of the things that we're conditioned into, these sort of unconscious types of learning. And then there's this third layer, the tertiary level, which is this mediated by symbols and culture, etc. Now, when we get into belief, you're sort of cross-cutting through these three layers. Most and the way I try to portray this in the article is to say that we have beliefs that are non-reflective, that we don't think about, we just believe them, and that's probably because we're conditioned into those, in our early lives, etc. And then we have reflective beliefs, things we think about. So if anyone tries to figure out what position they are on a given issue, that requires reflection, thought, consideration. It takes a lot of time, these kinds of things. Now, uh, the way I want to address it here is to say that there are emotional elements to any belief. The simplest element of emotional belief is to try to uh, diffuse the sense of doubt. And of course, this probably is easy for people to think about now as we live in an age of uncertainty, or a year of uncertainty, certainly, where we don't know what's going to happen. And also, we're questioning a lot of our own life ways and motivations. We've been forced to, many of us, but also some of us have decided to take on larger pictures to question. So but if people can sort of think about their own experiences, you want to get away from doubt. No one really wants to stay in doubt for that long. So what is it that's pushing us out of doubt? And the answer I offer comes from some of the American pragmatists, John Dewey and William James, who say that uh, doubt always, uh, the release from doubt is belief. And part of the satisfaction of believing something is not being in that state anymore, state of doubt. So that's one of the ways to connect emotions and belief. Now, of course, once you get into reflective beliefs, you're into this level of symbols, symbology, and we have so many symbol systems. People who are raised in one society are sort of used to one set of symbols. But of course, now we have a lot more access to different things. And after, I would argue, the 19th century push of anthropology, the early anthropologists opened up this whole other set of symbol systems. And what I'm trying to do in the article and in the book is suggest that the method by which individuals believe is a type of mediation between what you and your society that you're conditioned into find appropriate, and then your reflective position on that as an agent, as an autonomous agent. So there's these different levels of belief. And to put it simply, there's non-reflective stuff and there's reflective stuff. And the reflective beliefs are the ones that are the complicated ones that I think um, uh, you have a lot of interest in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. I mean, I think that that does a great job of painting a picture for us of what's going on and how that might relate to our brain structure. So yeah, so now I want to move on to a couple words that are a couple concepts that are a little bit bigger picture. So we just looked at some words that were more at the level of the individual kind of organism, at the individual human level. But now let's look at some bigger picture social concepts here. So you talk about all mythologies providing an explanation of the world, and quote, by virtue of giving an account of where things came from. And you go on to say that psychology as mythology gives explanations um, for two elements of human nature. It gives us a story of personhood and a materialist story of our physical constitution in the brain. Um, to me, materialism can be kind of a fraught term.
Mm.
So, thinking about what Noam Chomsky points out, materialism is a concept that over time continually accrues new meaning as scientific discoveries are made. So that is at the start of the scientific revolution in Europe, there's a clear concept of materialist intelligibility. It's body affecting body. And then there was a simultaneously a push to get away from what were deemed as occult ideas about invisible forces, sympathies, and antipathies, things like this at play in the world. But then in comes gravity into the picture, which apparently I think Isaac Newton was upset about at the end of his life. Couldn't reconcile that contradiction between the materialist intelligibility of body affecting body, that standard of intelligibility, and this seemingly invisible force that he was describing with his mathematics. Then we have the discovery of electromagnetic forces, then atomic and subatomic forces, dark matter, dark energy, et cetera, et cetera. So now we have a very complicated and possibly contradictory understanding of what materialism is. So could you talk about what you're indicating to when you talk about materialism and personhood in this context in your article? And what are the connection between these two concepts and how they're constituted in the social formation that we find ourselves in?
Well, the sense in which I use materialism is that the dominant strategy in empirical psychology is to say that the mind is the brain. And this is, of course, illustrated by things like by drug use, medical drug use, also the kinds of surgeries and the kinds of medical practices that have accrued around this notion. And it's proved obviously a very useful and a very, in many cases, medical cases, robust formulation of the nature of the mind. Um, but the question is, if the mythology of psychology is that the mind is the brain, are there elements that other mythologies in the past, like mythologies of Judeo-Christianity, for example, are there elements that are not being fulfilled by that, what one would call it, that positivistic equation of materialism? And one of the things I suggest is that some elements of ethics, of the moral position of mythology, is not being fulfilled. And that's what I go on to say later in the book. Um, but your description of materialism was very quick thumbnail sketch, and it was just listening to you saying it. It's amazing how how complex our understanding is, but also um, how incomplete it is, so to speak. So that's something to point out too, is that materialism is an approach, it's a metaphysical position, but it's also a promissory note in many ways. That is, if the mind is the brain, then here's what we know, but here's what we would need to know further for it to be a complete system. And it's not there yet. So, but it has proved to be quite useful in many ways. So I mean, this is probably a good time just to say this. This is not to say that psychology is a mythology is not to say that it's a social construction. That's not what I'm saying. And I think that's important because once there's an attack on materialism, a lot of times people think the alternative is um, some sort of constructionism. But what I'm trying to pull out in all of this is that if you are pragmatic about these things, there's going to be holes. There's holes in any kind of knowledge practice. There's repercussions for taking on a particular knowledge practice like materialism, and we should be aware of those. But I don't think accepting I don't think the incompleteness of given theories is negates their uh, practical utility. So that's a little bit of the neuroscience and materialism stuff for you. And we could talk about personhood, but if you want to reformulate anything.
No, I think that really in that description, you kind of answered that connection that I was interested in between materialism and personhood. Talking about what you're concerned about here is this kind of promissory note of like the brain, the mind is the brain, and this kind of conception of materialism, and how that's this in popular in research and in popular psychology, that's the what we see, what we see kind of playing out. And I appreciate you, given that context that, we're not, what you're trying to do here isn't say, oh, this is just a social construct. Oh, this is, we're going to just totally kind of throw this out the window as a social construct psychology, because, that can get us into, I think, like a very unproductive, maybe even nihilistic kind of relativism, and I think that that's something that for me has been attractive about your work and the work of like some folks, like I said, mentioned Terrence Deacon up front that you introduced me to, because, when I'm thinking about things like reification at those higher level, symbolic activities in the brain, when I'm thinking about that stuff, a lot of the reading that I've done on it, or that I did earlier on it, was very coming from a very kind of like either like cultural perspective or social science perspective, and it gave this very like, it was either like a positivistic thing. I felt like my choices were like just reified positivism or relativism, and I was like, well, I feel stuck between these two things, and there seems like there needs to be a third way. And I mean, yeah, you showing me the Terrence Deacon stuff and getting deeper into, your scientific work and the emotional mind, I was like, just big aha moment of like, oh, we can, there's other ways of talking about this. So
Mhm.
So yeah, I totally appreciate you saying that, and I think that it's a super useful thing for us to remind ourselves of. Um, so final word here, uh, in this section when we're unpacking these concepts, secular modernity. So secular modernity is another word that indicates to a huge category of processes that we have seen, taking shape for a long period of time. Can you talk about what the main characteristics of secular modernity are for you in this article, and how these processes emerged, and most importantly, what you see as the economic and political power structures from which it emerged and kind of continues to reproduce itself? And how's that all important to your work here?
Okay, I can't answer all that,
Okay.
but I can talk a little bit about secularism because it's a huge question. Um, the notion of secularism is a lot of people will trace it to the Enlightenment philosophers, and it's this notion that belief in metaphysical deities is not necessary, and therefore there can be different relations to meaning that is not mediated by deities. Now, at the same time as this philosophical view is coming out, we have the beginning of what we would call the modern liberal state, which is made up of various grades of citizens and relationships of production. So at the same time, we have to remember there's the Enlightenment and then there's the Industrial Revolution, basically right after that. And sort of in the 18th century, um, after what we call this long Enlightenment period, there's the French Revolution, which redefines notions of all kinds of things, including citizenship, including what it means to be free, including what it means to be liberal, including what it means, what what life is like in an urban environment too. So we also have this, with industrialization, um, we have this urbanization. So those are some of the factors that I think are relevant to how we exist in the world and how we sort of this modern period, so to speak. We have urbanization. We have less. We have various modes of mediation of meaning, um, and then we have this industrial production, and now we have this sort of post-industrial production. I'm not sure what to call it. This um, financial virtual production,
Right. Financialized capitalism here.
right? So all these things are relevant. All these things are relevant because, and this is the sort of difficult job of what I'm trying to do, is to say, how do our beliefs about the mind embody or follow from their context? And so this has changed. So I try to trace a little bit of this post-enlightenment stuff till now. And again, as I said, I can't fully answer your question right now, but secularism does not just refer to um, a lack of deities. I think it also refers to changes in social structures due to a lessening of the influence of the church, but also a different way of approaching reality and meaning within the context of the social forces that accompanied the philosophical challenge of secularism.
Nice. No, I think you did a great job getting to pretty much all of that question. I mean, so I appreciate you clarifying that for us here. Um, so all right, so let's move on to kind of the final phase of the interview here. Just unpacking the philosophical elements here, unpacking the epistemological elements here. Um, so just to frame it for folks again, we like to uh, you know repeat this stuff and be clear here. At Shred Magazine, we're super concerned about what might be called fundamentalist reductionism. So we're taking inspiration from people like Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, who in the dialectical biologist are critical of a fundamentalist reductionism that gives rise to what they describe as an alienated worldview, one in which turns the natural world into a machine. And we're also influenced by folks like Robert Sapolsky, who in many places warns against the tendency to reduce the world down to, just one frame or what he calls one scientific kind of bucket. So Sapolsky gives us some grisly examples of where this kind of reductionist thinking, oftentimes coming from very brilliant people, has been used to justify horrific social movements. So two examples he gives are from the neurologist Egas Monitz, who's a pioneer of the frontal lobotomy,
Right.
and Konrad Lorenz, who's an animal behaviorist and Nazi propagandist. So here, you end your article saying that, quote, psychology as mythology delivers at the same time too much and too little. And earlier on in the article, you talk about the methodological crises in psychology and its lack of effectiveness at tracing general laws. So, based on some of this stuff and based on how you and Asma open your book, The Emotional Mind, with what you call a kind of a dialectical approach, I can't help but think the quote too little part of this formulation from this article has to do with a kind of reductionism and reification in the field of psychology. Do you think, is this a correct characterization of your view? And either way, could you unpack that a little bit?
Okay. Those some interesting things you're bringing up. This phrase, psychology, promises too much and offers too little. Um, it's related to it. There's been this critique of psychology for a while now, about 50 years. In fact, after I wrote it, I've been reading Sigmund Koch, Koch, and he did a history of psychology, sort of history in 6 volumes, and he has written some other things. But his argument is very interesting. He's saying, he's a psychologist and a philosopher of science, and what he's saying is that psychology is bound to fail because it thinks that its topic is everything the mind does, and that's a patently absurd range of phenomena to study. So you think about botanists who are studying just these kinds of plants or this plants, or you think about animal ethologists who have a particular thing, and that kind of limited. It's not limited at all, but it's definitely more limited than psychology, which is beliefs, thoughts, emotions, all these things. Putting it all into one field is courting, a disaster, because you can't. We don't expect there to be a sort of. At one time, we thought there's going to be a unity of science, that every science is going to be reduced down to physics. This is something that people thought about 60 years ago. Now, it didn't really work out, because it turned out that other sciences have different. They break the world down differently in terms of how it's classified, and kinds of laws. There's different kinds of laws. There's nomological laws, which is law like it follows no matter what, like gravity, for example. And then there's historical laws, which is due to these contingencies in the past, like evolutionary biology is a historical system. Due to these contingencies, that's what it ended up being. And it might turn out different in the future. That depends upon other things. So those are kind of historical laws, and then you have these nomothetic laws, and it turns out that not everything will reduce down to a type of physics. There are theories in physics that are trying to do that, and they're quite esoteric, but they are trying to offer that. And but largely, I don't think that they have been. The fight isn't over. There isn't an answer yet. So psychology offers to answer everything, but what we get in fact, especially from empirical psychology, is, these little studies on little things in at laboratories, or we get these huge statistical reams of information mediated by statistical instruments, and then we get these pictures of the brain with these incredible instruments that we use. So it's amazing the kinds of data and the amount of data that's been provided in empirical psychology, for example. But it's also noteworthy that it's not giving us what it's promising to give, or what the people who started psychology promised it to give, or what we expect that this field of social science, human science, natural science will deliver to us. So the larger argument is that we might not be getting what we expect, but what are we getting? That's what the rest of the book is doing. Like, what are we getting in popular psychology? What are we getting in therapy? What are we getting? But then um, to admit it's not what we wanted. It's not what we thought we were going to get. And it should be pointed out that a mythology is supposed to do a little bit more in terms of meaning and significance, at least for ethics. That's what I want to get into towards the end of the book, about ethics and how the arts and humanities uses of psychology give a little bit more in terms of ethics and a little bit less in terms of explanatory modes.
Right, right. Um, and that dovetails, I think, really nicely with what I wanted to ask next. And talking about this kind of reflection on methodology. Well, we're interested across the board in science, in scientific circles, in cultural circles, in political circles, with the issue of reification, and are people reflecting on the analytical frameworks that they're using? Are they promising, like, okay, we have this huge analytical framework and we can fit everything in, into that, everything is going to be in that, or is it too small? I've heard like reductionist critiques of reductionism, where those kinds of approaches are called pejoratively like smallism, like, if we can just describe it on the smallest level, that's the real stuff there. If it's just, we can talk about why I want to, why I'm driven to eat food or whatever, and based on like quarks, or moving around or whatever the case may be, it's like, then that's like sort of real science. And I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, I personally tend to agree with that it's like that sort of project of trying to take these big picture phenomena and like reduce them down to just these like small little elements. It's that one thing is going to collapse on the next, is going to collapse on the next, and we're going to be able to explain it like down here. It's like maybe missing the point to how symbols are functioning, and how our relationship between things in the world and symbols and our senses, how that's working. And I think that's kind of the dialectical approach that we're trying to take with Shred. Is we're trying to recognize that the world is completely kind of interconnected at all these different levels, and our process of collecting data and interpreting data about the world is an active one. That's the point. And that is, the boundaries that we draw and the frames of reference that we use when we explore the world are not necessarily a given. So, that we must actively decide how we're abstracting the world and what our frame of reference is at any given time, depending on what aspect of the world, we want to learn about. And we think, and why I really appreciate the work that you've been doing is, we must communicate how we came to these decisions. And I think that this is this is really great reflection that's going on about the frame of reference that you're using for what here. So, when we do this, we feel like we recognize the great possibilities, not only in how we can interpret the data, there's this wide range of possibilities that we can interpret a given set of data, but like as Stephen Jay Gould points out, what can even be considered relevant data in the first place for something that we want to explore. And you already kind of answered this, but could you unpack a little bit more? What's the importance of reflecting on the frameworks that you're using, the data that you're using, the models that you're using? can you talk about more for folks the importance for that for you, and maybe how you've done this here a little bit?
Okay. If we take it, if we take it that psychology is the study of the mind for our culture, if that's the position that it has, then it's quite important because it it suggests to us, first of all, what is human nature, what is our form. If psychology is telling us what the mind is, it's also telling us what we are, what we're capable of, what's right and wrong. It has a lot of ethical consequences. um, I mean, you have to think about, you have a set of knowledge practices. You have certain kinds of biology, you have the study of material science, you have all, you have all these different formats of looking at the world, and you have groups of people doing each of them. Engineers doing this, you have humanists doing that, you have economists doing this, you have all these groups. This group, psychologists, are being called on to do very important work as well. Now, have we reflected enough on what the job of psychology is and what we've gotten from psychologists? That's sort of the project of this book. What have we gotten in all the different fields? What have we gotten in empirical psychology? What have we gotten in therapy? What have we gotten in drugs? Uh, what's the, what it's been 150 years. What have we got? And it's important to do that because we are, mm, uh, it's a certain point in history that we're at, and there are um, resources are shrinking in a lot of senses. There's things that are going to be there's different forces of power at play right now, and these kinds of this project of rethinking or of reappraising or of understanding the past within the context of our own goals seems necessary. It seems necessary to me. I mean, I'm interested in a sort of philosophy of science and epistemology sense as well, but I know for your purposes there are some elements of practice that for you are crucial. And it's not something I can speak to specifically, but I can say that reflecting upon knowledge practices, what we do when we want to find something out, what are the rituals through which we maintain these formats of knowledge, reflecting upon those kinds of things uh, is not a lot, not lost time. You know what I mean? It's not some theoretical esotericism, which we're also being led to believe with this anti-intellectualism and this sort of crowding out the public space and all spaces with this advertisements and crap. We're being told, reflection is sort of an elite practice, but um, I don't think it is, and I think that um, the more we're pushed away from reflection, the more we're bound into the conditions of our own sort of oppression or our own sorts of um, alienation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think again, that sets us up once again for our kind of concluding segment here, because I totally agree, and that's what we're trying to do here is that we want to make, we want to try to actualize the best we can in the world right now, and also struggle for a world, where a thriving cultural life, a thriving intellectual life, um, is available for as many people as possible. Where trying to popularize reflection and get people to, if we can, create space for folks and tools for folks to just reflect on what's going on in their lives, what's going on politically, who they are as people, not in this sort of like, limited self-actualizing kind of self-help kind of way, that can be very superficial. And I think, like you say in the article, can just reproduce, um, reproduce humans in such a way where it makes it, you know, um, uh, uh, that's beneficial for capitalism, for a particular type of economic production, but in a way where folks can organize more effectively to create a better world. Um, so so to get back around to back into this political importance of this, which I think we've seen a really great thread through this whole interview of, I want to read some excerpts from the article that I think hit home strongly about why we should be thinking about this from a political perspective, or I should say, we're going to edit in the reading of these excerpts into this interview, so I won't be reading them right this second, but they will be edited in. And I want to say again for folks listening, it's our mission here, to try to synthesize the important work of folks like Dr. Gabriel here into actionable tools that can be integrated into our political and organizing spaces. So that's something that you're going to be seeing from us, in the coming months after we start to publish details on our basic philosophical perspectives, and that's our sort of first round of publishing that's going to be happening here. Um, so we're going to splice in here the excerpts that we want to highlight.
Quote, psychology has come to take on the rhetoric of personal enlightenment in its therapeutic practices, and thus attempts to serve as a means of salvation. This is apparent in the self-help literature. The field of psychology gained in popularity by drawing on popular metaphors that shaped the human niche in an industrial landscape. In particular, psychology emphasized society's pressure to achieve efficiency through purpose, integration, and productivity. Identity and autonomy as the key characteristics of personhood came together to perpetuate capitalism through extending the notion of exchange value over all relations and melding seamlessly with techno-fetishism. Mythology was traditionally the expression of an enchanted world, and now psychology is an attempt to fill the disenchanted space with a rich characterization of interiority. Rami goes on to talk about how psychology fulfills our need for finding meaning through belief enforced by myth, which provides, quote, symbols and expressive ways to cope with the hazards of life. By providing explanatory tenets, psychology is thus a means of enabling humans to sustain their practices of personhood and materialism such that we can face the world with greater confidence and increased energy. Rami then talks about how our need for meaning in the realm of belief is shaped by the society. Quote, our shared world is maintained by the practice of rites, of rituals. The sacred nature of a symbol or story derives its power from the power of society. Whereas fire is sacred for the Brahmins, the scientific approach and the notion of the liberal individual are sacred in secular modernity. And how psychology as mythology grounds the materialist and historical origin story of mankind in neuroscience and empirical psychology. The cosmology of Enlightenment humanism is enacted in the rituals of personhood worked out in clinical psychology and, more esoterically, in popular psychology. Rami concludes by describing the woeful inadequacy of psychology as mythology, saying, while logic and science have proven more efficient in gaining control over the environment, the aspect of myth which dictates ethics has been underplayed. Modern man is, as Iliade claimed, in an anxious limbo in the middle of an initiatory ritual of dying. To believe in the importance of identity and materialism, he must face a vacuum of nothingness, which would render the rituals of life meaningless. The truth may be that there is no unassailable truth about human nature. Psychology as mythology delivers at the same time too much and too little.
All right, so can you unpack this quote that I think is at the heart of our political question from the excerpt that we just heard? So you say from the article, quote, in particular, psychology emphasized society's pressure to achieve efficiency through purpose, integration, and productivity. Identity and autonomy as the key characteristics of personhood came together to perpetuate capitalism through extending the notion of exchange value over all relations and melding seamlessly with techno-fetishism, end quote. So you've already talked about this a little bit, but can you unpack a little bit further in response to that quote? How does psychology accomplish this? How does this ideology support the maintenance of the power structures that we find ourselves in this capitalist moment that we're in?
Well, I can't answer all of that, but I can say in the first book I wrote in 2013 called Why I Buy, Self-Taste and Consumer Society in America, what I'm trying to do is connect those levels, the level of self and identity to these economic practices. And in that book, I connected it through this element, this component of taste. How does an individual make consumer decisions? And part of taste is um, is founded on individualism and uniqueness, authenticity, and a notion that Charles Taylor talks about, which is called expressivism, which is this notion that we're also have a space for expression in ourselves. So I would highlight those two elements of the modern self uh, as crucial um, sites of connection with the kind of liberal subjectivity that you're referring to. And as I said earlier, secular modernity is also enmeshed with the Industrial Revolution, with the rise of capitalism, colonial capitalism, etc. All these things are um, came about in the same sort of time period. Of course, there's all kinds of strands, there's all kinds of interpretations, like the ones you're referring to, that I can't speak to particularly. Uh, but maybe that's just a little start because I don't feel comfortable going too much into all those other things.
No, that's great. No, I'm, yeah, again, appreciate you, um, giving us a start there of what your perspective is. Um, okay, cool. And just to kind of round off our interview here, you know, would want to invite you here to be a little bit more speculative or imaginative if you want to be. And what are some things that you would really like to see? Some things changed, to some things that you would like to see to help this situation change. And it doesn't have to be like a sort of process oriented kind of thing, like, oh well, this is how we're going to get from point A to point B to point C, from like an organizer's perspective, but just from, I guess, since we are narrative based creatures, and sometimes having these stories or these imaginative moments of the world that we would like to see, what are some things that you would like to see you know differently here to take care of some of these issues with how psychology is used? What are some things that you would like to see differently, or either in the practice of psychology or just in society in general?
Well, I am hoping that there's going to be a spring this year in Chicago, and as you know, from when you lived here, it's this feeling of coming outside and this relief. I'm hoping we have a spring of the public sphere in a way, because the public sphere has been closed off in so many ways for with precautions. But I'm hoping for a spring for all of us. And in terms of psychology, which is more pertinent here, there are some contemporary psychologists who are reflecting upon the shortcomings of psychological methodologies, and are suggesting using methodologies from other fields. For example, some people talk about using more historical methods from practices of history. Some people are saying use more anthropological methods of understanding worldviews in the people's behaviors in laboratories in the context of worldviews. And then there's also interesting work being done about how do you accept there are values that people who practice psychology are also bringing values into it. And how do you use that in a good way rather than say, oh, if you have values, then it's no longer objective. It's, it's not a science, it's not objective. But to think, well, people have values, systems have values built in, institutions have values. How can we take that and use it to enrich study? So there's someone, her name is Lisa Osbeck, who has written a book about this. So there's interesting things going on in terms of how to change it. There's some books by Jerome Kagan, which are highly critical of what's been happening in psychology, but are offering ways of saying, let's change the paradigms. Let's expand the paradigms. There's no reason why we have to keep using these methodologies. I mean, there's issues also in in education for psychology, in terms of how in the academy, how much do you need to know to be a psychologist? Do you just need to know methodology and statistics, or do you need to know things from other disciplines? What does it mean to be a psychologist in 2021? Is it the same thing as 20 years ago? And I'm sure many departments have taken on this challenge, but these are the kind of things that I'm interested in, and of course, changes in that way. There's this notion of what is interdisciplinarity, what is the point of it, and what can it accomplish, and I'm interested in how those projects move forward and what sort of fruits. I think there's some point we need to also be critical about what exactly are we getting from interdisciplinarity. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in the near future.
That's great. No, I think that's a great note to end on. Some suggestions for what folks can check out. Some authors, some thinkers that folks can check out who are interested in some updated stuff. Some folks who are thinking along the same lines as you about psychology and how we can sort of improve the practice of that. And really especially this we're hoping here too, again, for a big spring of the public sphere. I think that's something we want to fight for the commons, and for folks to have to be able to have those flourishing social lives, intellectual lives, cultural lives, so on we go. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in here, and I really want to thank Dr. Rami Gabriel for taking the time to talk with me. Again, this was an extreme pleasure to have you on today for one of our first interviews here, and I hope that we can continue some of these conversations and get into some of these details in the future.
Thank you, Eli. I appreciate you having me, and I wish you guys the best of luck.
Thanks so much.